right, so our goal here is to understand the Encomienda system, and as you suggested through our sort of collective brainstorming session in the warm-up, this has a lot to do with the way that the Spanish organized their colonies here in the New World. So we know that the Spanish fairly quickly decided that they wanted to create a large-scale settlement. We know that the Spanish are going to cover a big sort of swath of land. They have a really large territory, so they go, like from California all the way through like New Mexico. They have some inroads in Texas. They've got some inroads in Florida, not to mention Mexico and other parts of South America. So the Caribbean. Anyway, the Spanish have a whole bunch of territory they're trying to cover, and so they need a way to organize and to figure out how they're going to govern that. And since although there are lots of Spanish who arrive and come to the colonies, a larger sort of population within their territory is going to come from the Native Americans. So how are the Spanish going to relate to the Native Americans? And of course the church has a lot to do with that. And we sarcastically talked about in class on Monday that the church really provided this justification or this way to explain or to show an advantage to the system that the Spanish developed. And basically the argument went that if the Spanish and the Catholic missions are going to save the eternal souls of the Native Americans, then anything they asked in exchange would be, like a super great bargain for these Native Americans. So from the beginning, the justification is really going to be religious. And in the beginning, the role of the missionaries was really strong. These were often Jesuit priests, but not always Jesuits. But anyway, so Catholic priests were going to come. And they had a huge controlling factor in the Encomienda system because they, for example, would set the standards for dress. They would work with the political government of whatever the settlement was, and ensure that laws were passed to require participation in church services, to criminalize any sort of appropriate forms of worship. So the Native Americans were trying to sneakily include their own religious practices or their own religious beliefs, that would be criminalized and sort of forcibly quashed. So the Catholic Church is going to play a really strong role in how the system works. They don't set it up, they don't create it, but the actual day-to-day functioning of the Encomienda system and the justification for the system is going to really come from the Church. But it's impossible to separate the Encomienda system from the idea of violence and coercion. The sort of bottom line was that anyone who came, these individual people who were given these grants of land in order to settle and to govern, they were given the grant of the land and all the resources on and in the land, which included human resources, the Native Americans who might live there. And so although it's not slavery in the sense that we would think about it today, there was no formal enslavement, they weren't carted away from their homes or things like that. Functionally, the way that the Encomienda system worked was essentially slavery anyhow, right? So labor was coerced. There was no oh, I don't want to do this. And every aspect of day-to-day life was then governed by the Spanish political establishment in conjunction with the Catholic Church in order to further the Spanish interests. And of course, the biggest part of Spanish interests are going to come in profitability, right? The Spanish came for three reasons, the three G's, right? God, gold, and glory. Glory, they go and the conquistadors go and they conquest, take over civilizations. God, of course, comes in this missionizing aspect, but nobody should forget gold. Because money is certainly a very powerful motivator. And so the economy of the New World, they had sort of experimented a little bit to find out what was going to work. There wasn't that much gold, actual gold as it turns out, in the New World. There was, of course, the fabled 7 cities of gold, that various conquistadors tried to find, and of course it didn't exist. But what there was in large supply in the New World was silver, so lots of silver to be had. So some Encomienda systems were built around silver mines, and so the Native Americans on that land would then be forced and coerced to go into these mines, working in dangerous conditions. But places where silver mines were not, or silver was not one of the resources that was available, then we really do often see the Encomienda system working around agriculture. In the Caribbean, this agriculture system was more often than not the growth of sugarcane, right? To grow sugarcane, to harvest it, to process it down into creating the various sugar products is an incredibly labor-intensive process, and is also given like the elements and the quick pace of labor the Spanish sort of required. What could also be very dangerous. So physically cutting the sugarcane takes an enormous amount of strength and can be very punishing on the human body. Then huge rooms where they'd be boiling, giant vats of sugar in order to like process down the sugarcane. Again, lent itself to the possibility of accidents. We're not talking. Nobody wants to work on it. This is not where you want to be. But in any case, the results were pretty profitable. In fact, in the Spanish, as you read in your reading that we talked about, or that we finished up on Monday, the Spanish really did benefit in a huge way from the methodology that the Native Americans are going to teach them about where is the silver, how do we, what are the agricultural processes that we use, as well as from the actual labor of the Native Americans, because there weren't enough Spanish settlers to have sort of wrested a profit from the New World. And so as you can see in this picture, encomiendas were typically very strongly organized. These were they developed quickly into towns. This might look to you like a southern plantation, with slave quarters and so on. And the makeup is fairly similar. There's going to be a fort sort of centrally located. This is also usually where the church would be. There were villages where the Native Americans would stay under the watchful eye of the Spanish, of course, to make sure that they weren't fomenting some kind of rebellion or something like that. The fields would be there. They would usually had to be built fairly close to some sort of water source so that they could transport whatever goods that they produced for export back to Spain so that they could make that profit. And so really, it's through the encomienda system that we begin to see the kind of strong settlement patterns that the Spanish established, right? I mean, so somebody asked me earlier today about Texas history. I mean, we can look through the American Southwest, we can look through Mexico, we can look through the Caribbean, and we see these long-standing and permanent elements of Spanish conquest, right? We can see the towns are built in Spanish style, the grid-like structure. We can usually still see the church mission, the building which often still stands. All of those kinds of things. The Spanish are going to have, although the Spanish Empire will decline over time as the Spanish government sort of declines in power, relative to the other European powers, the actual Spanish impact in North America was really strong. But the last thing I want to leave you with is the idea that this didn't always go so well. And the best example of that is the Pueblo Revolt, which occurs in the late 1500s, maybe the early 1600s. I can't quite remember that. But in any case, this occurs in what is today New Mexico. And it involves a whole group of Native Americans who we call the Pueblo because it's sort of a nice shorthand for people who don't know all the details. But in reality, there was 5 or 6 different and completely distinct tribes who did not speak the same language. They were all toiling under Spanish leadership, and the Spanish weren't super concerned. They knew that there was a lot of sort of negativity going on. They knew that they were having to crack down on dissent or crack down on people trying to kind of skirt the rules. There was sort of, everybody knew that this particular region was a little bit volatile, but the Spanish weren't so worried because they had big forts with soldiers there, and they didn't think that there was any possible way that the Native Americans could unite against them, right? They were these diverse tribes. The tribes themselves had enmity before the Spanish arrived, so there was distrust between the different tribal groups. And so there was not that big of a worry. But actually, hatred of the Spanish was a pretty good motivator for unification. And this guy named Pope begins to organize a unified revolt against the Spanish. And the way that they, of course, Native Americans don't have written language. There's no modern technology like timekeeping devices. There's no telephone where you can call and say today's the day. None of those things are possible. So Pope actually begins to travel. He offers gifts. He hires translators to be able to go from place to place very secretly. Then talking to each of these distinct communities. And once the community agrees, yes, we're with you. We'll rebel against the Spanish. He creates for them a knotted rope, and the rope has knots for the number of days between the day that they talked and the day that the rebellion was supposed to happen. So each of these distinct tribes, which were all spread out across New Mexico, had this rope, and every day they untied one knot. And the idea was that when they untied the last knot, that was the day they were supposed to attack. So allowing for coordination without any actual communication, after this first contact. And in fact, the rebellion is really successful. There are some contemporary accounts of the Spanish who talk about the horror. Native Americans would come into the Spanish missions and the Spanish forts. Two priests had their throats slit and then were thrown off of this cliff. Churches were desecrated. There was sort of mass destruction, like whole villages that are going to be burnt to the ground, where the Spanish had lived. Just really incredible violence. And the Spanish they cannot resist. They try to fight for a little while. They realize they're widely outnumbered and they retreat. And so at the very least, in the short term, the Pueblo Revolt is successful. They kick the Spanish out, and we don't really have another equivalent example of the kind of success Native Americans had. But what's important is that you heard that word short term, right? Because less than 70 years later, the Spanish come back. And they come back with more guns and more weapons and more people, and they very quickly sort of re-subjugate the entire region and restore Spanish control. But there's a big but, and don't you dare giggle because I said big but. There's a big but, and the but is that despite the fact that the Spanish have now come back and regained control, that the Pueblo ultimately did not win true independence for themselves, they could not resist the Spanish when the Spanish decided to come back and retake the area. Despite all of that, the Spanish do notably change the way that they approach their colonization and their settlement patterns. And so although we still do have forced labor, we still do have Spanish political organization, Spanish political control, we still do have Catholicism playing a large role, and Native Americans who are obligated to convert to and or practice Catholicism. Despite all of those things that persist, the level of control that the Spanish try to exert, level of cultural control that the Spanish try to exert over the Pueblo is going to be dramatically different. The Spanish, for example, they're going to require that the Native Americans are Catholic, but, if they want to, incorporate, some of the traditional dance they did and, use that dance as part of, the traditional Catholic feast day celebration, in honor of, Jesus, then that would be okay. Or, if the Native Americans wanted to come to church dressed in their, fancy clothes, but, their native culturally fancy clothes, as opposed to, having to wear, Spanish-style clothes, maybe that would be okay. And what the Native Americans do in their own homes, so long as it's not overtly pagan or overtly problematic, we're not going to be so worried about those little details. And so really what we see here is some cultural accommodation. Now the fact that we're talking about these tiny concessions as cultural accommodation should tell you how oppressive the Spanish were prior to this. But it is going to set us up for the sort of long-term Spanish colonial system in which there really is a blending of cultures. The whole idea of a mestizo race, right? So white Spaniards who are going to marry and have children with Native women, then creating these mestizo children. We see gradation. So there's this caste system that develops, but it's not just white and Native. There's whites from Spain, and then whites born in the New World, and then the mestizo, and then Native Americans of particular tribes that had lighter skin color, and then Native Americans from other tribes that had darker skin color, and then African slaves. There's this whole very complex system of interaction, and they're not separated. And then English colonies, for example, really we had very distinct settlements. There was no working alongside Native Americans together. There was very little mixing of the races. Englishmen don't tend to affiliate with Native American women. Those things were very distinct in the English settlement. But in the Spanish settlements, really as a result of things like the Pueblo Revolt and other similar circumstances, becomes this really blended culture. So what I want you to do now is